Back everybody after coffee. Thank you for sticking with the pace. It's been such an exciting and interesting day today, and I know I'm going away with so much food for thought as I go back into practice at the beginning of next week. I'm going to shift the focus a little bit over the next 40 minutes or so and focus in on this area of resilience in parents of children with complex health needs and life-limiting conditions. The information that I'm going to be presenting relates to a study that was completed earlier on this year. And the study itself came about really from my experience and practice. I'm a children's nurse, that's very much my identity. And I've worked with children and families with complex health needs and life-limiting conditions for over 20 years. And I suppose, like everybody sitting in this room, we're all very aware of the considerable additional pressures and demands families experience when a child has such high levels of needs, when their life is unpredictable and their future uncertain. And I think we see those consequences ripple out across all aspects of family life. And when we look in on families, there's times that we are quite astounded because we see families coping really well under very, very challenging situations, and then at other times families struggle. And that generated an interest in what was it that maybe influenced this variation in response, and was it something that we could do something about? That led to a little bit of a focus on the area of resilience, and in turn an application was submitted to our Public Health Agency for some research funding in Northern Ireland, and that was provided to actually fund the study. Part of the reason why this study was funded, I think, is a growing recognition that we need to be thinking more not just about the medical consequences when people have disease, but also looking in on really trying to invest in things that impact on health and well-being. And certainly in the Northern Trust, for example, let me see, here we go. In their family strategy, it very clearly also articulates that what we're looking to do here is to recognise that the best place for children to be cared for is within the context of their families. But they are also looking to move away from crisis-led interventions towards more early interventions that promote resilience and early family support. So what I was going to do over this presentation was just to focus a little bit of time in on what is resilience in the context of children with complex health needs and life-shortening conditions, and to reflect a little bit on the role professionals play in family life, and then maybe to start giving some suggestions as to ways that we may be able to make a positive contribution to enhancing resilience in families of children with complex health needs and life-shortening conditions. Just in terms of the study, it was a 4-stage study. And what we did initially was really try to unpick what resilience was all about, get a clear understanding that if we were looking to influence resilience, what would that look like in an intervention and how could we go on to measure it? We also wanted to learn from the literature what has proven effective in the past, and also to take on board messages of things that have been tried that haven't been effective, because what we don't want to be doing is to be wasting resources and family time in things that we know are actually likely to have a limited impact. Once we had that body of information, we took it to parents and we took it to professionals. And the feeling there was to make sure that we were on the right tracks. Were we talking about things that were meaningful to them? And what was it they would like to see if we were looking to build a programme or something that was there to hopefully impact on their health and well-being? When we had that information, we refined it. So we came from stage 1, we got the parents' views, we got the professionals' views, and they helped us to refine our thinking, and that information then was used to help develop the intervention which took place in stage 3. And we did that through an expert working group of psychologists, social workers and nurses over a period of about 5 months. When we were ready, we then went back to the same parents to see, have we built in what you were telling us? Does this resonate with you? Is this something that you think is likely to be of help and of benefit to families? And the same questions to the professionals, and also we were looking then to see, is it going to be viable to implement in practice? Today's talk is simply going to focus on a little bit about resilience and then pick up on some of the key messages that were coming back from parents. Resilience has a very high profile in our media coverage nowadays. There's not a day goes past that there isn't some relevance to the term. And certainly we've seen it over recent months in a range of disasters that have hit right across our countries, whether it's in terms of the flooding in Houston after Hurricane Harvey, whether it was in terms of the Grenfell Tower disaster in London, or also the terrorist atrocities that have been visited upon cities, whether that's in Manchester, in London, or more recently in Barcelona. But Misha Hussein, writing in The Guardian in 2013, sent out a challenge, and basically his challenge was, is resilience really meaningful for us? Is it a useful thing to focus in on, or is it just a buzzword? Is it jargon, really? And he asked two questions, basically. He said, sorry, is that coming up? There we go, sorry. He said that it poses a challenge in terms of its own right. Instead of bringing clarity to the table as envisaged, it has brought utter confusion. Firstly, nobody really knows what resilience means, or perhaps more accurately, everybody has a different understanding of it. So therefore, it is true, resilience is very much a nebulous concept, and it's very difficult to pin down when you start to try to work with it. But there is a huge body of research now going into this area, and different researchers will look at resilience in different ways. Some will very much focus on resilience being a trait within ourselves, and very much linked to individual factors. For others, it's an outcome. We live through a period of adversity, and we get to a point in time where we can look back, and while we've lived through the difficulties and our health and well-being has perhaps plummeted for a while, we've got back to a place where we're functioning as well as we were beforehand, or in the case of post-traumatic growth, actually at a better place. But for others, it's very much a process. And Anne Maston, who's a leading resilience researcher in America, would say that resilience is the capacity of a dynamic system to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten the viability, the function, or the development of that system. And we looked at the pictures from the newspapers there, and we looked at the resilience being connected to Houston and Manchester and Barcelona. And there is very much a societal context that we need to bear in mind. But the reality is that resilience plays out at the level of the individual and the individual family. And I think that's the most significant context in which we need to be considering it. A little bit about what resilience is then. And certainly all the different ways to look at resilience are underpinned by the work of Lazarus and Folkman. The issues around stress, appraisal, and coping. And basically what we're looking at is the fact that demands are going to come along, and they're going to go into one pan of the scale, and that's going to pull the scale down. And how we get that pan of the scale back up is both in terms of how we consider and appraise the significance of that demand, but also the fact that we have got things that we can do. And it's about mobilising those resources that are actually going to help restore a level of balance. I think it's important, though, that we realise that we live in the dynamic context. We bring with us into our new experiences of stress our experiences from previous encounters, for good or for ill. There are times that we are particularly vulnerable, and our capacity to respond well is severely impacted. And I think also there's times that the demands just come too fast and quick, and we're dealing with too much, too hot and heavy, and we're just trying to deal with too much all at the one time. When we start to then unpick resilience, we need to be thinking about resilience in different ways. We need to be looking at the individual factors, we need to be looking at the interrelational factors, and we need to be looking at the societal factors that are at play. And I think we also need to be thinking about key processes. And in my work, the key processes are very much processes associated with navigation and negotiation. When we move into the individual resources then, the things that we are thinking about are things like our self-efficacy. Are we confident that we'll get through this? Our locus of control. Have we a belief in ourselves that we can influence the outcomes? Our hardiness, can we sustain, can we commit, can we keep going? Our sense of coherence, can we understand the difficulty that we're in? Can we make meaning out of it? And can we also believe that we've got the capacity to manage this situation? Our emotional intelligence, our faith, and our positive outlook are factors that will influence our individual resilience. And these are variable between us, and certainly if you are well endowed with these aspects, you've got a little bit of a foot on the ladder when it comes to dealing with adversity and demands in our lives. When we move into the interrelational context, though, we need to start thinking in terms of systems. And at a biological level, it's something we're very familiar about in terms of our own biology, in terms of homeostasis. The picture here is of an ant colony, and that to me depicts the capacity for systems to adapt and respond. And what we're looking at is the ability to self-organise, to adapt, to recover, to sustain, and to transform. Systems theory teaches us some really important lessons. It teaches us that no fixed normal exists, and to fight against change is going to lead to systems collapse. Maintaining that function relies on the presence of interacting parts that can flex and change, and that there are two paces of change afoot. When adversity happens, things have to change really quickly. So that's the change that occurs at the time of crisis. But at other times, there are slow changes afoot, gradual changes that can occur during periods of relative stability. And by investing in slow changes when we have the opportunity, we are getting ourselves better fortified in terms for things that come along further down the line. And the important thing about systems theory is that it takes us into a wider context. It tells us that by moving beyond personality traits, resilience is amenable to intervention, and that's a really important lesson for all of us, I think. Michael Unger's work in Canada from the Resilience Research Centre, he works a lot with at-risk youth. And when he looks at resilience in the family context, he unpicks this by saying that when it comes to a traumatic event that threatens the family, each member can influence how the family responds. To the extent that the family maintains everyday positive functioning, like emotion sharing, making meaning, self-organising to get instrumental tasks accomplished, and the pursuit of collective goals, the family will sustain its collective resilience and the resilience of individual members. And that starts giving us areas that we can focus in on with families about growing their awareness of how these things are enacting in their own context, and are there areas that we can help try and enhance some of these areas of engagement. So when we move into then the resources in the interrelational context, we're thinking about how members communicate, how they approach problem solving and goal setting, how cohesive is the family unit, how flexible is the family unit. Do they affirm each other? What is their faith perspective? What is their collective outlook? Moving on then to the social ecological theory context. I'm sorry, just in the translation, some of the boxes have come out of kilter a little bit on the presentation, but when we look at this, we're really talking about connectedness. And the reason why there's a dream catcher here is because the Native Americans had a real understanding of the importance of connectedness. And the quote here is that humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. And if you ascribe to this perspective, it highlights to us that our interactions with family are not cost neutral. They have a consequence. They have a consequence for them, and they have a consequence for us. So it's really about saying that we've got a responsibility to be thinking about how our interactions are actually impacting with families, and that's going to be variable depending on the individual family. So when we look at the societal resources, then what we're looking at are things like their support networks. Support networks are one of the most critical resources we have available to help us get through difficult times. What is the support they get from their community? Where do we come into play as services? And what are the consequences of government decisions in terms of impact at family level? Moving on then to the key processes, navigation and negotiation. And again, Michael Unger in Canada, his definition of resilience is that in the context of significant adversity, resilience is the capacity to navigate to the psychological, social, cultural, and physical resources that sustain well-being, and the capacity to negotiate for these to be provided in meaningful ways. My interpretation of this is about two things. Navigation is about personal agency. It's about being able to identify what you need and being able to access it. Negotiation moves us on a little bit, and to me, negotiation is about empowerment. It's about people having the voice to be able to speak up and to get things in a way that actually meets their specific needs. So moving just quickly back in, we've touched on the theoretical framework bit, and we're moving now on to the findings from the study. So we're going to unpick a little bit of what parents had to tell us. An overview of how the study went forward, simply to say that the ethical and governance approvals were in place and that the study took place across 3 sites in Northern Ireland. It was based on qualitative methods, so it was interviews and focus groups with parents and then professional workshops. And numbers-wise, we had 18 parents in the first stage and 14 parents saw us through into the second stage of data collection, with 15 professionals in the first stage and 12 into the second. Data was collected through audio recordings and it was transcribed. And we used a deductive approach to thematic analysis in this case because what we were looking to do was to see whether or not the parents' experiences were mapping out with the resilience theory that had been developed earlier on. And we have to bear in mind that there are limitations of small samples here and that these parents were at a particular point in their life when they were participating in the groups. And just to say that the parents' views very much mapped onto the theory, the theoretical framework. And there were clear lines connecting all the aspects together. I'm going to talk a little bit around 3 of the key themes that came out that related to the journey, balancing the load, and the role of professionals in family life. I think when we talk about the journey, it's a language that we're terribly familiar with, and we use the term very frequently when we think about families as they are progressing down their lives as families of children with complex health needs and life-limiting conditions. I wonder, do we really take stock of how it feels? Do we really have an understanding, and I'm not sure we can unless we've lived it, but do we really bear in mind just how changed the world families is, for families it is, whenever they move into a situation where they've had catastrophic and life-changing news? And just how that feels. And suddenly families that have been functioning extremely well suddenly lose. They don't have, it's not that they lose it, they don't have the knowledge, the skills, and they don't have the competence and confidence to navigate a very changed world. And I think for this mum, it was very much that sense of falling. And there was a period of time after that where she felt she got her feet. Navigating was very real to families, and the challenge of navigating that world was also very much an issue that came through in the parents' stories. And we make assumptions that we have made it clear to people that they know what we're there to do and how the roles interrelate. But for this mummy, she was saying that, I went to the GP to get oxygen and I went, to different places a number of times. And she said that while she knew that everyone was there, she wasn't really sure who was doing what, and that was an issue, she would say. For parents, they did develop and become experts in their children's care, and I think I would like to think we would all acknowledge that. That period of getting to the point of being experts varied very greatly. For some parents, it happened very quick. They had a lot of the individual resilience resources that enabled them to get there that little bit quicker. For others, it was much more of a struggle. Parents want to be seen in this as a partnership. They want to be seen as human beings coming in with their level of knowledge and skills and expertise and experience of their child. And for that to come alongside this 50, the fact of a surgeon who's very frequent in doing cases, but to recognise that he's got his areas of expertise and she's bringing something unique to the table as well. And I think, parents are living lives that are very much in the dynamic. Things are changing, and just having people who are there to do a little bit of future proofing with them, future spotting. How are things now? How are things going to change? What should I be thinking about now? Was something that Mum said she would really have appreciated. She didn't feel that she had any sort of anchor to go back to. This kind of knew her situation and was able there. She wasn't looking to be directed, she was looking to be guided. And again, in terms of navigation and negotiation, there's differences in the approach if we're looking to facilitate. Moving on then to balancing the load. A number of things, as we can imagine, that add to the loads. And the parents' stories were consistent in terms of what impacted and added to their load. And I'm not going to pull this out because this is very much resonates with the existing body of literature. In terms of the caring load, just the day-to-day meeting the needs of the child, the hospital appointments, the practicalities, the impact that had hugely in terms of siblings and the anxiety and guilt that parents carried with them in terms of how their siblings were missing out. What came through for me really strongly was the emotional load. And again, I think maybe we do not give full cognizance to just what a load parents are actively carrying and actively managing on a day-to-day basis, and the amount of isolation that comes along in hand with that. Because when parents are conflicted, it's very difficult to share that. And for some, they couldn't even share it within the confines of their relationship. So you've got two parents sitting in a house in very, very different places. And the amount of anger and guilt that parents were carrying was just really quite colossal. But parents also were reported things that actually lightened their load. What was clear in this was while the things that added to their loads was consistent, the things that lightened to their load was much more variable. And for some parents, they were very, very clear in the personal attributes. They knew exactly what was going to be helpful. They knew when to say, no, I don't want that. They knew how to be assertive. They knew that they could influence the outcome. For a lot of parents, it was about not looking too far ahead because it was just too difficult to manage. There's no point in trying to second guess it because you can't, and then feeling guilty because you're thinking about it because I shouldn't be thinking about it. I should be living for today. And that just gives a bit of an insight into the amount of effort that's going in to actually manage to stay emotionally balanced on a day-to-day basis for some families. Again, some of these things were clear within the families and times that they weren't there. Families that had that connectedness and flexibility was a very resilience-enhancing resource for them when they were able to communicate openly across parents and that they took that collective problem-solving approach. For one mum, she basically said that her relationship was such a fundamental resource for her, that her husband was really strong, that they were in partnership together, they were a team, they cared for their child together. She trusted him implicitly and he grounded her. But for other families, that was so much not the case. When it comes to support, and I said that the network of support is one of the most valuable resources that we have to help us sustain us in difficult times. For families, this was a depleting resource. It was consistently that this was a resource that depleted, both in terms of practical assistance. When the children were getting bigger, their care needs were getting more difficult, and people were scared. And we know that that's the reality. But also in terms of emotional support. And parents were really scared to share that because they just found it difficult to share, and they were also scared that they were going to end up having to carry everybody else's anxiety and distress, and they just didn't have the capacity to do that. For families, where their capacity to maintain social networks was very much diminished because they came out of work, they did not have the time or the energy to continue to invest in friends, so their networks very much reduced. So moving on then to the third theme, which was around the impact of professionals in family life. So if families have diminishing networks of support, that increases the significance of professionals in families' life. And parents were very clear in telling us that there were times when professionals were actually adding to their load. They got very frustrated when support wasn't there, when there was a lot of investment in maybe a very specialist team who knew their child intimately, but a member went off sick and another one was on leave, and there was nobody actually to go to for support. There was times when people were offering them support and they didn't want it. Coming back to this need for things to be meaningful to individual families, there's no point in offering, the respite has no value to families if that's not what they particularly needed. For that family, for example, what she needed was somebody to come in and help do the housework and keep the house clean when she was in hospital with the child, and that actually proved extremely difficult to access for her. And again, interventions that don't take account of the parents' expertise when they are sidelined and people come in and are judgmental in terms of how they're caring for their children. Just a little bit of a snapshot in terms of the impact of appointments, and we know this and we keep trying to make this better, but I think what came clear for me was that for one mum whose child was not expected to live, they went a year with minimal appointments. They had the supportive community children's nursing team that was able to keep an eye on the family, and the minimal need to keep taking their child out to appointments really gave them an opportunity to gel as a family and to become a family. And I suppose that just challenges me to think, we need to be thinking clear as to, are these appointments really essential and can we give some families a break? In terms of the language that we use then, coming back to what was said earlier on, this is very much a clear message too, and a little bit surprising for me too in some of this. Some of the language isn't understood. A mum gets a letter and says, come to the paediatric clinic, and she hadn't a clue what that meant. Just the most basic of terms. She got down the line, she learnt the world, and then she knew, and it made sense to her. But in those very early days, she conveyed this as a sense that she was trying to learn to swim. There was so much going on, and just something like a word that made it difficult for her to really get to grips with things. It was like a foreign language to me. She had so much to cope with, and she had no idea. When we start to think that investing in resilience-enhancing activities might be good for families, the word resilience has absolutely no relevance to families at all. They're too busy living it and just getting on with it. So therefore, how we're presenting things has got a really important context. For this mum, she just said, it was just too difficult to lift the stone and have a look underneath. She's busy just being a mummy and getting on with things, and she didn't have the time to sit back and think about herself because she was worried that then she was going to have to take action and that she didn't have the time to do. And a word that I've tried to stay away from in this presentation is the term coping. Because I learned through this study just about the emotional weight that comes when a parent is asked how they're coping, because it's very much linked to a sense of judgment, either self-judgment that they're failing as a parent if things aren't going well, or that other people are judging them, and if professionals are judging them, are they going to take, if she says I'm not coping, are people going to come in and take action? So I think in terms of just the sensitivity of the language that we need to be thinking about and the impact that that is having when it's on people are on the receiving end. Parents were very clear in identifying helpful support too, and helpful support was support that was useful. This is a mum who was 5 years down the road before she could say, this is when things turned the corner for me. She had a community children's nurse that came on board. There were other people there beforehand, but they weren't really doing anything. And all of a sudden, this person was doing something useful, and she identified this as one good person. I'm not sure we are mindful to the psychological needs of families. And I think that's an area that we have to get much more attuned to. I think this is a very honest quote from a mum where she was saying that she doesn't even remember the turning point, but the first year was quite horrific because you were inundated with professional people, which was in that sense good. And she recognised that every box was ticked for her child, but she felt suffocated because they were all doing their job and they were doing everything that they had to do, but there was nobody helping her to take a step back and sort of try and work out actually what was going on here. And I think if we're going to help families to sustain, we can't do a lot to lighten a lot of the demands that come their way. We have to be able to give them that space to take a step back and actually consider what is playing out in the wider context. We've heard about the importance of the therapeutic relationship, and that is the underpinning factor that is most significant. And these families' lives, as we know, are so difficult, and to open up and actually convey to somebody else just how difficult it is really relies on having that trusted relationship, that knowing that somebody else can hold what they're going to say, and that it's not going to create a lot of problems for them. And this sense of losing control, of never being in control, that's a very, very difficult thing, to be honest, and to say to somebody. How are we able to perceive what's going on in families and to be attuned to picking up the messages that they are not able to say to us verbally? And I think the other thing is about subtle expertise. Being clinically strong and competent, being able to go in and do a task well, is not enough if we are not respectful of where the family are, if we are not basing our ways of working in line with what that family's needs are, because what happens is that families are turning away support if that level of subtle understanding does not come through. So final couple of slides, just some strategies that may be of help. I think there is a place for us to be asking the question, are we adding or are we lightening this family's load? And I know that's a challenging question, and I know that it's not an easy question to get an answer to, but I think attuning our awareness to that gives a starting point to actually be thinking about impact. We can start to integrate resilience-enhancing activities into the way we support families, but I think we have to start that off very early. And we have to do it in a way that is normalising. We have to do it in a way that it builds on the competencies and skills of people who are already involved with the families, rather than bringing somebody else in or waiting for the family to go into crisis. And we do that through how we engage, for creating spaces for parents to think, and really helping to create and do targeted activities that focus in and help families identify what are the things that work well in their suite of resources. And all families have got resources. And then looking at how we can actually then tweak and maybe enhance some of those and help them to sustain and keep going with the things that are going well. I think for me, a big lesson is to learn to avoid being judgmental. We have to bear in mind that these families will be challenged. There's no question the level of demands that they are encountering are none of us would not be challenged in that situation. But there are times that the demands just get too much in our resources, and I'm talking at a personal level now. They get depleted and we can't get back on top of things, and that leads to a crisis. But a crisis is not a sign of failure. A crisis, resilience will tell us, is that something bigger needs to shift, and it's working then in a way that doesn't necessarily just throw resources at a family, but underpicking what is going on here so that we can respond in a way that is more targeted at that family's needs. I think everything that I've said has got a resonance for how we all live our lives. We don't know the point in time whenever adversity is going to strike. And if we can prepare ourselves as well as we can in advance, I think there is more likelihood of us being able to sustain through difficult times. And I'm a great believer in the Little Princess philosophy. And I suppose for those of you not familiar with this child book, what this little quote is all about. It's about attending to our own personal toilet, investing in things. Look at how we communicate in our relationships. Look at how we collectively problem solve. How flexible and cohesion are we within our relationships? Because if we do that, the difficult things will be less likely to take a hold. And if we don't do that, whenever we do face adversity down the line, we won't be as well prepared to sustain. And my last slide is this. To all of us, there's a place where we need to be thinking about lightening our load. Be consciously aware of the demands that are coming your way. Be consciously aware of the things that you can be doing to offset those demands. And it's not just your body and your mind, it's your whole well-being that will thank you for it, and take that approach into your work. Thank you.